Hello students, this is Professor McDermott once again. The history of ancient Egypt has fascinated me ever since I was a little boy, and that fascination has been shared by many people throughout the world. This is really a remarkable culture. The nation of Egypt was a superpower, really, for nearly 3,000 years in the ancient world. A very stable, very wealthy, very strong nation. And that 3,000 year period is divided into three major eras of greatness, the first of which is called the Old Kingdom. So, in this lecture, which is really a combination of two shorter lectures, we'll start by talking about what's called the Old Kingdom of Egypt. But first, in order to understand Egypt, you really have to look at the geography of Egypt. So I mentioned in an earlier lecture that the Nile River in northeastern Africa is the longest river in the world. Now, up and down the Nile River, you have areas of whitewater rapids that are called cataracts. You see them marked there on the map. There are several. Egypt consists of the Nile River Valley north of the first cataract. You see that there on the map next to Aswan. There's now a very important dam there, the Aswan High Dam. But Egypt is all of that river valley north of the first cataract. In prehistoric times, Egypt was divided into two areas. And Upper Egypt was actually in the south part of Egypt because it was closer to the origins of the Nile River in the mountains in the southern part of Africa. So the southern part of Egypt was called Upper Egypt, and the northern part of Egypt there, centered on that delta kind of swampy region emptying out into the Mediterranean Sea, was known as Lower Egypt. Egypt, well, before we talk a little bit more about how those two regions became unified, I do want to emphasize Egypt was and is surrounded by the Sahara Desert. And so, really, it is only possible for people to live a few miles on either side of the Nile River, and the rest of the country is essentially uninhabited. Today, 99% of the people in Egypt live on 3.5% of the land area in Egypt, just right there on the banks of the Nile River. So it's a very long, kind of skinny country. We already talked about Upper and Lower Egypt. Those two regions were first united around 3100 BC by a man named Menes in Greek. Narmer in the Egyptian language is his name. And Menes was the ruler of Upper Egypt, and he conquered Lower Egypt. You see there in that sculpture on the left there, that bas-relief sculpture, a depiction of Menes wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, conquering the king of Lower Egypt, and making Egypt one unified country. And so Menes became the first pharaoh. This is the title of the kings and some queens of Egypt. And that term actually means in the Egyptian language great house. It refers to the palace that the pharaoh lived in. And actually it's interesting, it's not so different even from our nation, because you know sometimes on the news they'll say the White House did this or the White House said that, when really they mean the president, but they're referring to the president based on the house that he lives in, the White House. And so it was kind of like that in ancient Egypt. the palace gave Pharaoh his title. Um, and the pharaohs of Egypt were incredibly powerful people. Most of the time, Egypt was very unified and stable, and the pharaoh was really an absolute ruler. In the 3rd century BC, a priest of the Egyptian religion named Manetho made a list of all of the rulers, all of the pharaohs of Egypt, and he divided them into 30 dynasties. Okay, a dynasty is just a family of kings and queens. So when the crown is passed down within the same family for a period of years, we call that a dynasty. Right now in England, the dynasty on the throne is called the House of Windsor. You may be aware, and their members of that family have been ruling England since the early 1700s, down to the current ruler, Queen Elizabeth II. So according to Manetho, there had been 30 different families or dynasties that had ruled over Egypt. And under the first 2 dynasties, the period from 3100 to 2686 BC, we call this the Archaic period. This is the era when Egypt was just taking shape, if you will, was kind of coming into its own as a great power under those first 2 dynasties of pharaohs. But it was really with the 3rd dynasty that we enter into the first great period of Egyptian history known as the Old Kingdom, which lasted from 2686 to 2181 BC. Now, if you look at that, that's 505 years just for the Old Kingdom of Egypt. That's just one of the 3 great periods of Egyptian history. You compare that to our nation, which has only been in existence for about 240 years. And you see the incredible longevity of this ancient Egyptian civilization. In Egypt, the system of land ownership was different than what we saw in Mesopotamia. Now, there were Egyptian gods, we'll talk about some of them later, and they did have priests and temples. But in Egypt, the priests and the temples did not own the land. Instead, Pharaoh actually owned all of the land in ancient Egypt. So essentially, all the farmers were renting land from the Pharaoh. They lived in small villages up and down the Nile. And when they brought in their crops at the end of the harvest, they were expected to pay about 50% of their crops to Pharaoh in taxes. And so the pharaohs of Egypt were incredibly wealthy. They were given about half of the produce, the farm produce of the nation, and that made them very, very rich. And also the fact that people lived in these small villages, for the most part, made Egypt much easier to control than Mesopotamia. We saw how Mesopotamia was dominated by city-states. When you put a bunch of people together in a city, well, look out, you just never know what's going to happen, you know. But in Egypt, people lived a simple farming life. Most of them lived in small villages. And that made it easier for the pharaohs to control them, especially since they all lived right on the Nile River, and so the Egyptian navy could sail up and down the river and keep tabs on what was going on throughout the country very easily. And the Nile was really the center of everything in ancient Egypt. People sometimes call ancient Egypt the gift of the Nile, because the Nile was really the source of all life in ancient Egypt. And one of the readings that you're going to have about ancient Egypt, from ancient Egypt, has to do with the way that the Egyptians saw the Nile River as a life-giving god. And that was partly because the Nile was so cooperative in terms of farming. In the Mesopotamia lecture, we talked about how the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers flooded every year at exactly the wrong time. At the time when the farmers were gathering in their crops in the spring after the winter growing season, and how that caused the Mesopotamians to have to make great efforts in their irrigation to prevent that flooding from destroying the crops. Well, the Nile River floods in late summer, which is exactly the right time in the Middle East, right before that winter growing season. Absolutely perfect timing for the farmers. So the Egyptians did have an irrigation system in which they regulated the flow of the flood and brought the floodwaters onto the fields. But essentially, the Nile was a lot more user friendly than the Tigris and the Euphrates. Most years it would flood in the right amounts and exactly when it was supposed to. And so that helped to make Egypt a very rich, very bountiful, very prosperous nation. Well, when you think about ancient Egypt, one of the first things that we think about are the Great Pyramids. These were built during the Old Kingdom by three great Old Kingdom pharaohs of the fourth dynasty, Khufu, Khafra, and Menkaure. Now, there are many pyramids throughout ancient Egypt, but these three are considered, they are the largest and they are the most important. The pyramids were public building projects, and they were the tombs of the pharaohs. There's an internet rumor that they were used as storehouses for grain. That is not true. Their sole purpose was to serve as the burial places of the pharaohs after death. And so what would happen after the spring harvest? During the summer, farmers would be drafted essentially by the government to work on building these tombs for their pharaohs. And it wasn't exactly slave labor. I mean, they were paid mostly in bread and beer, but it was certainly very hard work. The tallest, the greatest of the three pyramids is known as the Great Pyramid of Pharaoh Khufu, and it contains more than 2 million blocks of solid stone, each of which weighs about 2.5 tons. That is 5,000 pounds each. And furthermore, the workers who worked on the pyramids did not use animals to drag those stones into place. We think that the way it was done was that they built ramps made out of earth all the way around the pyramid, and the workers themselves would drag those stones up those dirt ramps and shove them into place with sheer manpower. And you can imagine what backbreaking labor that was. The Greek historian Herodotus from the 5th century BC actually visited Egypt, and he talked to some of the priests and elders there. And they told him that the Great Pyramid of Khufu had taken 20 years to build, and about 100,000 men had worked on it. And when you think about the magnitude of this task, that actually does not seem to be too far-fetched. So this is one of the great achievements of humankind, and in the ancient world it was considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid of Khufu. And if you look at the pyramids and think about their symbolism, really, in a way, they kind of represent ancient Egypt in a nutshell, because they were meant to last forever. They were meant to never change. And that's kind of how the Egyptians saw themselves. They were a very traditional minded people. Everything they did, they kind of made to last, and they wanted it to last forever. They honored the ways of their ancestors, and they tried to follow them. And they really didn't like change very much, for the most part, the people of ancient Egypt. So the pyramids, in a way, kind of symbolize that eternal, unchanging aspect of ancient Egypt. And also, the pyramids were sealed off, so they would have very complex passageways inside. The pharaoh's body would be somewhere in the center, but they would be sealed off completely. The goal of this was to prevent the pyramids from being robbed, because they had precious objects in them, gold and jewels and priceless works of art and so forth, that were buried with the pharaohs to accompany them on into the afterlife. And so they were sealed off from the outside world. Now, over the years, all of the pharaohs' tombs were robbed, except for one. We'll talk about that later. But in any case, this was very similar to the situation of Egypt itself. You know, it was surrounded by the Sahara Desert. It was, in some ways, cut off from the rest of the ancient world, or at least it was very difficult to get there to invade ancient Egypt. And so that helped Egypt to become and to remain a very stable society for about 3,000 years, as I said. Also, you know, the pyramids, sometimes people look at them and they think, wow, the Egyptians must have been very morbid people. You know, they must have been obsessed with death to spend so much time and effort on building these tombs, you know. And actually, I don't really think that's true. You know, life was pretty good in ancient Egypt. The people were pretty prosperous, for the most part, generally quite happy. The reason that they put so much effort into this was that because they expected the afterlife to be even better than the present life, you know, that they would continue to enjoy all the good things that they had enjoyed in this life, but only in greater abundance and with greater pleasure. And so they really looked forward to the afterlife, and they really prepared for it, and that's why they put all those things in the tombs with them, foodstuffs and so forth, to accompany the mummies of the pharaohs, which were carefully preserved and also meant to last forever. We know a lot about Egyptian beliefs about the afterlife, because in each tomb there was buried in the tomb a kind of guidebook to the afterlife that was called the Book of the Dead. And also in your readings, you're going to have a little excerpt from the Book of the Dead. You see part of a Book of the Dead papyrus there at the top of your screen. By the way, the Egyptians invented paper. They made it from a reed that grew in the Nile Delta called the papyrus reed, and that's where we get our word for paper. And so some of these papyrus scrolls have actually been preserved in the desert conditions of Egypt and have come down to us. And they tell the story of what the Egyptians believed was going to happen after they died. So this is their myth, their legend, their story about what they thought would happen after death. Well, first of all, the soul would travel to the underworld, where he or she would meet up with the king and queen of the underworld, whose names were Osiris and Isis. You see them at the right-hand side of that Book of the Dead image there at the top of your screen, Osiris and Isis. The soul would be brought in front of them, and then the person's heart would be removed, and it would be weighed in one of those old-fashioned scales. Now, if you look at that image, you see one of those old-fashioned scales. You may have seen one in a pharmacy or in a chemistry lab. the kind that has like one pan on one side and one pan on the other side that balance out. And so the jackal god Anubis, who operated the scale, would put the person's heart on one side, and then on the other side he would take the feather out of the headdress of the goddess Mat, whom you see depicted on the right here. Now, Mat was the goddess of order and harmony in ancient Egypt. Okay, a kind of symbol of the good life, how life was supposed to be lived in an orderly and harmonious manner. And so, if the feather of Mat balanced with the person's heart, that meant that the person had lived a good, upstanding life and could then proceed on to enjoy a very happy afterlife for all eternity. But if the person's heart was heavy with sins and evil deeds and so forth, and anger and malice and hate and all of that, it would outweigh the feather of Mat, and then the jackal god Anubis would throw that person to a monster known as the Devourer, who would eat him up, and that would be the end of that person, because he had not lived a good life. So this is what Egyptians believed about the afterlife. A little bit more about the god Osiris. There's a very interesting myth about Osiris. Osiris had a brother named Set, who was jealous of Osiris, and so Set actually killed Osiris. It's kind of similar to the Cain and Abel story in the Hebrew Bible. Set killed Osiris, cut him up into little bitty pieces, and scattered them all up and down the Nile River. Well, Osiris's wife Isis was heartbroken, and so she wandered all over ancient Egypt, picking up all the little pieces of her husband that were lying around, and she sewed them all up back together, and Osiris came back to life long enough for them to have sex, and that enabled Isis to conceive and give birth to the god Horus. Horus was a hawk-headed god. You see him there in the image, standing kind of in front of his parents' throne. And so Horus then set out to avenge his father's death. He killed Set, his uncle, and became the first pharaoh of Egypt, according to Egyptian belief. Now, one of the implications of this story, well, first of all, it's a very interesting story that kind of, in a way, it even anticipates the resurrection story of Christ, for, with Osiris coming back to life for that period of time. But what it also meant was that Pharaoh was considered to be descended from the gods, because the first Pharaoh, Horus, they believed, had been a god. And so the Egyptians really believed that their Pharaoh was a divine being, a god. And that too contributed to the great peace and stability and order in ancient Egypt, because after all, if you believe your ruler is a god and has divine power, of course you're not going to want to do anything to get on that person's bad side. All right, well, we proceed into considering the Middle and New Kingdoms of Egypt. That's the second and third great period of Egyptian history. How did the Old Kingdom come to an end? Well, it had to do with a pharaoh named Pepi II. Okay, and on my lectures, when you see that R period, that means he reigned or ruled from 2278 to 2184 BC. And you see that's nearly 100 years reign. This is the longest royal reign recorded in all of human history in any culture. Pepi became the pharaoh when he was 6 years old, and he lived to be 100. And so he ruled over Egypt for 94 years. Very remarkable, but as it turned out, that was not very good for Egypt, because as Pepi became very, very old. He kind of lost his grip on power and what was happening in the country. And you start to see Egypt becoming fragmented. So late in Pepi's reign, first of all, you see that there are separate viziers for Upper and Lower Egypt. What was a vizier? It was kind of like Pharaoh's right-hand man. In the Bible story of Joseph, who was kidnapped, sold into slavery by his brothers, and was sent to Egypt as a slave, eventually in the story, Joseph becomes the vizier of Pharaoh, Pharaoh's chief assistant. Well, anyway, with two different viziers for Upper and Lower Egypt, late in the reign of Pepi II, you see that the country is starting to split apart. Local politicians or bureaucrats increasingly begin to make important decisions and take a lot of power onto themselves. So do the temple priests. And so essentially, because of the long reign of Pepi II, Egypt starts to descend into anarchy and chaos. Pharaoh loses a lot of power. The country becomes decentralized. So that when Pepi finally died, his family was replaced by a new dynasty, the 7th dynasty. And Manetho says that in the 7th dynasty, quote, 70 kings ruled for 70 days, end quote. In other words, it was like a revolving door, one pharaoh after the other. No one could hold on to power. Until finally, starting in 2181 BC, after the 3 years of the 7th dynasty, you get what we call the first intermediate period. A period when Egypt was disunited for about 125 years. This was very unusual in Egyptian history, which was normally very, very stable. But there's this period of chaos and confusion, the first intermediate period. But towards the end of that, a powerful ruler emerged in Upper Egypt named Mentuhotep II, and Mentuhotep succeeded in consolidating his control over the whole country, Upper and Lower Egypt, making himself the pharaoh and inaugurating the Middle Kingdom, the second great period of Egyptian history that lasted 400 years from 2040 to 1640 BC. So Egypt, after that period of anarchy, returned to its normal state, which was very unified, very orderly, under the rule of these very powerful pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom. But the Middle Kingdom too eventually came to an end, and that had partly to do with what historians have sometimes called the invasion of a group of people known as the Hyksos. The Hyksos. And this took place sometime around 1700 BC. But that term invasion is probably an error. Really, the Hyksos invasion was more like a mass migration of people from some other place, probably fleeing conditions of famine or starvation, and trying to find a better life as immigrants into Egypt. We don't exactly know where the Hyksos were from, not for sure anyway. That term just means princes of foreign lands. But many historians believe that the Hyksos were actually from the land of Canaan, which we now call Palestine, Israel, the modern nation of Israel, being part of that. We think about that as being the homeland of the Hebrews, the Jewish people, but there were many different groups of Canaanites in the land of Canaan. And it seems that they were undergoing hard times, and that some of these people migrated into Egypt. You see the Egyptian art on the left there depicting the Hyksos. This is the way that Asiatic people from the Middle East would have been depicted in Egyptian art. So many historians think that they were from the Near East, the land of Canaan. And the Hyksos helped to destabilize the country of Egypt. And in fact, they became so powerful in Lower Egypt that starting in 1640, you have a separate Hyksos pharaoh, a pharaoh from this Hyksos group in Lower Egypt, while Upper Egypt split off and continued to be ruled by a native Egyptian pharaoh. So once again, Egypt became disunited for a period of 90 years. We call this the Second Intermediate Period. It's interesting, I mentioned the Old Testament figure of Joseph in the book of Genesis in the Hebrew Bible. One of the reasons historians think the Hyksos must have been from the land of Canaan is that this story really seems to reflect the idea of a group of people from the land of Canaan, that is Joseph and his brothers, coming into Egypt from that land. And so that too seems to provide some support for this idea that the Hyksos were originally from Canaan. However, around 1550 BC, another powerful leader emerged from Upper Egypt. His name was Ahmosis. He defeated the Hyksos pharaoh, conquered Lower Egypt, and reunited Egypt under his family, the 18th dynasty. And we call this final period of Egyptian greatness the New Kingdom of ancient Egypt. And it was certainly during this New Kingdom that, in a way, Egypt began to look beyond its borders and to start projecting its power even more extensively, and becomes a great superpower in the ancient world. I want to talk about some of the more important and interesting pharaohs of the New Kingdom, beginning with the story of what happened when Pharaoh Thutmose II died in 1479 BC. Now, he had a son who was Thutmose III, but Thutmose III was a little boy when his father died. And so his mother, Queen Hatshepsut, decided to take over the throne and rule in the place of her son, Thutmose III. And she became recognized as the pharaoh, the ruler of Egypt. One of the few cases when a woman was able to seize the supreme power in this very male-dominated, very tradition-minded country. And it's interesting, some of the things that Hatshepsut had to do to project her power. Look on the right, you see one of the few surviving images of Pharaoh Hatshepsut, and you notice, oddly enough, that she's wearing a long beard. Now, I'm sure Hatshepsut really did not have that much facial hair. It's a fake beard, clearly. Why would she feel the need to wear this fake beard? Well, of course, again, it's a male-dominated society, the beard being a symbol of male power. Apparently, she felt that in order to project her power and to protect it, she had to appear in public with this beard on, and kind of putting on the trappings of male domination. But in her policies as pharaoh, Hatshepsut really did some things that were quite original and innovative. Well, first I want to mention that she built one of the most beautiful temples of ancient Egypt. I'll come back to this slide, but there it is, the temple at Deir el-Bahri as her tomb. Also, Hatshepsut in 1470 BC sent ambassadors to the nation of Punt to try to open up trade and commerce with Punt. We're not exactly sure where Punt was. Some people think it was Ethiopia. Some people think it was in the Middle East, maybe in what's now Saudi Arabia somewhere. But in any case, Hatshepsut seemed to be more interested in trade, commerce, building bridges with other countries rather than in going to war with them, and she showed this by this very famous trading expedition. So in that way, you could say maybe she broke the mold and set out in a new direction that maybe a male pharaoh might not have followed. Now, Hatshepsut did rule for quite a long time, 21 years, but eventually she died, and after her death, there was an attempt that was made to really erase the memory of Hatshepsut. Probably her son Thutmose III, when he finally came to the throne, was very resentful that his mother had kept him off the throne for so many years. And so, if you look at the inscriptions about Hatshepsut, her name has been rubbed out, erased, and most of her statues and depictions were actually destroyed and vandalized. Like I said, this is one of the few that actually survived. However, fortunately, enough information survived about Hatshepsut that she has come down to us as one of the most famous female rulers, really one of the most famous rulers of the ancient world. Excuse me. Also, really intriguing figure from the New Kingdom, Pharaoh Amenhotep IV. At least that's how he started out his reign in 1353 BC. Now, I said earlier that the Egyptians were a very traditional-minded people who were afraid of change. Amenhotep IV was unusual in that he really embraced change, especially in the area of religion. Now, traditionally, the most important god of the many Egyptian gods was the god Amun-Ra, who was the sun god. However, Amenhotep IV gave the sun god a new name. He started calling it the Aten. And you see in the picture there on the right, in the carving, the Aten, the sun god, shining down his rays on the pharaoh and his wife, the beautiful queen Nefertiti. And furthermore, Amenhotep IV announced that from then on, the Aten was going to replace all of the other Egyptian gods, and the Egyptian people should forget about worshiping, Osiris and Isis and Horus and Anubis and all the other gods, and they should worship the Aten. And to mark this very important change, Amenhotep IV changed his name, and the new name he took was Akhenaten, which means the beloved of the Aten. And in fact, he built a new capital city called Amarna and moved the entire Egyptian government there to show that he was starting off on a radically new direction. And he actually succeeded in achieving this, at least during his lifetime. Akhenaten was radical, not only in terms of religion, but in other ways as well. And to kind of bring this out, first I want to show you a picture of Akhenaten's father, the pharaoh Amenhotep III. This is how an Egyptian pharaoh was typically portrayed in art. You see that he looks very powerful, very strong, very independent, very buffed out, in good shape, etc. Now look at the picture of Akhenaten. He's the one on the left there. His queen Nefertiti is on the right. Wow, what a difference, First of all, you see that the pharaoh is not alone in this picture. He's with his queen and with several of their children who are climbing around on him. So he's presenting himself not as a powerful, strong ruler, but more as a devoted dad and family man. And furthermore, if you look at his body, you see there's no attempt to make him look stronger or more powerful or better looking than he was. Look at those skinny little toothpick arms, that little pot belly, Apparently Akhenaten was very secure in who he was, and he didn't need to present his body image in some kind of glorified way. He was very comfortable with who he was and actually allowed himself to be depicted in a way that was radically new for a pharaoh. Sigmund Freud, who is really the founder of psychoanalysis, a doctor from Vienna around the turn of the 20th century, um, wrote a book called Moses and Monotheism, in which he argued, well, first of all, I should explain the term monotheism. Monotheism means worshiping only one God, okay? Whereas polytheism means worshiping many gods. Okay, so the Egyptians were a polytheistic people. They had many gods, as we've seen. And it was always believed that the Hebrews were the only monotheistic people in the ancient world. But Freud, who was actually a Jew, wrote this book, Moses and Monotheism, arguing that Moses must have been at the court of Akhenaten. He must have grown up in the palace with Akhenaten and his family, and that's where he learned monotheism from this worship of the one sun god, the Aten. It's a very interesting theory. Um, Slightly flawed in that we know from the inscriptions that Akhenaten actually allowed himself to be worshipped as a god as well as the Aten. So in a sense, there were two gods during his reign, the Aten and the Pharaoh. But still, it's a very, very intriguing theory that Freud brought out. Like Pharaoh Hatshepsut, this very radical pharaoh Akhenaten was very interested in promoting trade with other nations. We know that because a large number of cuneiform clay tablets have been found at Amarna that show the trade relations Egypt developed with Mesopotamia under Akhenaten's rule. And so, again, like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten seems to have been more interested in trade than war. But his experiment came to an end when he died in 1335 BC. He was succeeded by a teenage boy named Smenkhare, who ruled for a short time. And then Akhenaten's son, Tutankhaten, became pharaoh in 1333 BC. Now, this is the pharaoh that we know as King Tut, and we know a lot about him because his tomb was the only tomb of any Egyptian pharaoh to date that was not looted and robbed. And so in the 1920s, the archaeologist Howard Carter discovered King Tut's tomb filled with all kinds of fabulous treasures and incredible works of art that I'm sure you've heard of. They tour around the world on a regular basis. Okay, so he has become one of the most famous pharaohs in Egyptian history, but he was not a very powerful pharaoh. He came to the throne as a boy, and at some point during his reign, he changed his name to Tutankhamun. Now, what does that tell us? Well, it seems that he stopped worshiping the Aten because he dropped that out of his name, and he went back to the worship of the old sun god, Amun-Ra. So he became known as Tutankhamun. Probably what happened as a weak boy pharaoh, he seems to have come under the control of the priests of the old religion, who were able to convince him to abandon his father's new religion and go back to the worship of the old gods. And indeed, in the tomb, there are many depictions of the old Egyptian gods. So it was under King Tut, King Tutankhamun, that this experiment with kind of quasi-monotheistic religion came to an end, and Egypt went back to the way it always had been, polytheistic. But still, it's quite fascinating, this figure of Akhenaten and what he attempted to do to shake up the kingdom of ancient Egypt.